Lord Jesus, as we come to sit at your feet now, would you give us yourself and speak to us by your Spirit, in your own name. Amen. Children are welcome to go to their time of formation. They're going this way today. Well, it's been a bit of a scary week to look at the news, hasn't it? The things that we've been watching seem to have just gotten turned up and just turned up to intensity. The news from Afghanistan. I don't know much of anything, but I grieve for our brothers and sisters there and many other things as well, but especially for those. I grieve for people who've lost loved ones in the war for these many years, watching the news there. Watching the pandemic news, not feeling a bit happy about that and feeling quite unsettled and really not wanting to have to go back to making those hard decisions, but just watching that news, coming school year, thinking about parents having to make those hard choices and people in schools, leading schools, having to make those choices. Even the very world we live in, the air we breathe, the earth we stand on. The news this past week about climate change that is the best guess now is in 20-ish years we'll pass the threshold. And there seems to be no real will amongst people to deal with that. The fires. A fire in Siberia isn't getting nearly as much news amongst us as the others, but there's a fire in Siberia that's larger than the fires in the U.S., Canada, Greece, Turkey, and other parts of Europe put together. It's the largest fire that we have record of, however far back that is, I don't know. It's not surprising, I think, given all of this and given what 2020 was, it's not surprising that a lot of people are losing it. I mean, quiet desperation, that's passé, right? We lost the quiet. Quiet desperation, that's so 20th century. We just don't do the quiet bit anymore. It used to be that in times of turmoil, people flocked to God. It's not that simple anymore. And why not? If you go way back to 2017 BC, 2017 before COVID, you go way back to 2017, in New York City, First Things, the Theological Cultural Journal, First Things, every year they put on their Erasmus lecture. Erasmus was a famous Christian humanist of the Renaissance period. And every year they have a different scholar come in and do a quite good lecture. 2017, it was the Catholic Bishop of Los Angeles, Bishop Robert Barron. Now, if you don't know Barron, but you're inclined to podcasts, go find him. The dude is spot on. And his Erasmus lecture, I think we've got the link to it. I'll tell you that after the sermon. We got the link to this lecture in your notes. Don't read it now. You can read it at home. I'm going to quote some of it to you. What he's going to say is that the sense we have today of Western culture turning against God, being afraid of God, being afraid that faith is even a dangerous thing, has its roots in bad theology 800 years ago. And that what we're experiencing today in that sense is quite reasonable, not good, but reasonable. It's the logical working out of the seeds that were sown back then that have taken this long to come to fruition, in a sense, and we now are reaping the harvest of that. So he begins by saying, there's nothing new in the arguments of the so-called new atheists. He says they all borrowed from Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and Sartre. And what all the atheists, new and old, have in common is a mistaken notion of God. For to a person, they construe God as one being among many, an item within the network of conditioned things. All right? He says, this is a misconception, the roots of which are deep and tangled, stretching all the way back to antiquity, but he's going to go back and put the problem 800 years ago. And basically what he's going to say is that as all heretical theological ideas do begin, there were folks 800-ish years ago who were noticing that the world was getting complicated and complex, and they wanted to make it easier. So they thought they're doing a good thing. They want to make it easier to grab a hold of God in faith. But in the process, unwittingly, they basically reduced God to being the greatest of things. And what Barron is going to do then is he's going to say, what happens then is we start comparing ourselves to God implicitly, and we start expecting God to do better. Come on, God, the world is a mess. Couldn't you manage it a little better? Right? You hear that. I mean, you don't hear it in those words, but you hear it, don't you? If God is good, if God is powerful, then why? Where is he then? Why couldn't God have sorted this out when it hurt me? We live in that water. We swim in that water. And what Barron's going to do is he's going to say, we need to go back and capture better theology. And he's going to, being a Catholic bishop, he's going to go back to one of my favorites, and that's Thomas Aquinas. And he's going to go back to Aquinas, and he's going to note that Aquinas says that God is, as best as we can express it, being itself, or the being within being, or something. I mean, the point is that God is never within the grasp of our description, really. And yet he's real. But he's not the best of things or of beings. He's not the infinite of all the beings. He is in simply a different category. Barron's going to call this mistake, he's going to say that it leads to a competitive God. He said, if God is the greatest of beings, then God and creation are competitive, and a zero-sum game does obtain. If God is to get all the glory, then the world has to be emptied of glory. Anybody grow up with rapture theology? Right? Rapture theology rather than Revelation 21 and 22. This is how this stuff plays out. This is what he's talking about. So yes, he's in the weeds. He's way back. But he is talking about the stuff that our neighbors, friends, others feel and talk about, that many of us were taught in church as well. He's going to say, if grace is to be fully honored, nature in that kind of thinking has to be denigrated. If salvation doesn't involve my participation in any way of trust, then cooperation with grace has to be denied. It leads to disembodied spirituality. It leads to dualism. He says, I find that the competitive God still haunts the imaginations of most people today, especially the young. He then does a quick overview trace of how this has gotten ever more intense and explicitly expressed in Western culture. He says, Feuerbach felt obligated to say no to the competitive God. He said, quote, the no to God is the yes to man. And then Barron says, every atheist since has followed him. Jean-Paul Sartre in the 20th century captured the exasperation with the competitive God in a syllogism. If God exists, I cannot be free. But I am free, therefore God does not exist. And then he quotes neo-atheist Christopher Hitchens, observing that believing in God is like accepting permanent citizenship in a cosmic version of North Korea. And that is how progressive culture sees it, right? We know this. We live with this. This is how progressive culture, when they go spirituality shopping and they come to the Christianity store, they're doing their window shopping and they look in and they go, I don't think so. But Irenaeus, early church father, had said, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. glory of God is the human being fully alive. And Irenaeus had then brought that around full circle and said, the life of the human is the vision of God. There's a way that we are meant to relate to God that makes us fully alive. And because of God's love for us and having created in the first place and wanting to having created, that brings glory to him. But because he is other and in a whole different space and the essence of being or something inexpressible like that, then it also brings fullness of life to us. So, Barron helps us. He says this, I would suggest that the best biblical image for God is the burning bush. It's on fire, but it's not consumed. It appeared to Moses. The closer the true God comes to a creature, the more radiant and beautiful that creature becomes. It is not destroyed. Rather, it becomes the very best version of itself. And Barron says, this is not just fine poetry, though it is accurate metaphysics. So Moses, think about it. Moses, of all people in his moment, right? Do you think Moses' mama knew where it was that the Pharaoh's wives and women went to bathe in the river? Right? She knew what she was doing. All the boys are going to be killed. I don't want my boy to be killed. Let's make this basket. We'll put him there. Lo and behold, they discover him. I love it. Brilliant, courageous woman. And then they're standing there going, what are we going to do with him? And she says to his sister, hey, run along and tell him you know somebody who can take care of him. And they do. And Moses is brilliantly cared for by his mother. And then he rises up in Pharaoh's household. So he, of all people, knows how the game is played. And he remembers his mother and her brilliant love for him. And he cares about his people. And so he sees one day an Egyptian overlord, working the Hebrew slave cruelly. And he stands up for his people and he strikes the overlord and kills him. But then he hears people talking about it. So he flees in fear. So he's out in the middle of nowhere, tending the sheep, saying, great, I've run my life into a dead end. And he sees this thing. He sees this bush, and lo, it is on fire, but it is not burned up. So he walks over to see it. And God says to him, the place you're standing is holy ground. And the first thing God says to him is in keeping with the way that up to this point in the Old Testament, God has tended to reveal himself. Speaking within the story God is weaving. I'm the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. I'm working a story. I'm working redemption through a chosen people. That's the first way God speaks to him. And Moses says, okay. God says, I want you to go to Pharaoh and tell him to set my people free. And Moses, and we read the story with all these umpteen generations and way back there, and we know how it ends. And we just sort of think, oh, isn't that neat? And we feel so good. But you put yourself in Moses' place, right? And Moses asked the quite reasonable question, God, you've got to be kidding me. I'm going to go and say, and not only are the Egyptians not going to believe me, but the people of Israel aren't going to believe me either. They're going to be like, you're crazy. Why on earth would we put ourselves to death by listening to you? Right? And then, because God is asking something that big of Moses, God reveals himself in a commensurate way that is that big. And it's a way qualitatively different and better than God has yet revealed himself in the scriptures to that point, or will until you know who. We'll get there in a minute. And God says, tell them, I am has sent you. Now, the Hebrew root of I am and the Hebrew root of the Lord are very similar. What does that mean? That means that the God who is the essence and the ground of all being and who we could talk about in these very abstracted terms, and he deserves it because it needs to be acknowledged that he is other. and unique and not finite and not just another being, but he's simply qualitatively different. It's a whole different thing. The same God that we can talk about that way, I am that I am. I simply am. There's no conditioning. There's no talking about it all. I just am. That same God is also the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. In other words, he is transcendent and other, but he's not aloof. He cares and he participates and he's active in the world. And Barron then is going to help us turn that other corner and see the ultimate burning bush. But before we get there, one last thing on Moses. When God reveals himself to Moses in this most profound way that shows the most of who God is, because he's also calling him to such an incredible work, challenge, job, he will later tell them, if you will structure your life in the promised land, there will be no poor. If you'll structure it the way I tell you, there will be no poor among you. If you will keep the Jubilee, if you will release people from their debts every 50 years, if you will restore unto them their land so that everyone has a plot of land, then no one will fall too far below and no one will get too far ahead, and there will be no poor among you. If you will keep the Jubilee, if you will give the land a Sabbath every 7 years and trust me, the trust me and the live in a physical world working together. If you will trust me, that you'll be able to eat, you agricultural people, even though I'm going to give you a whole year off from plowing and all that stuff. If you'll trust me and live in that and breathe, then you'll develop into a kind of people who will never plasticize the ocean, who will never be so overcome by your empty, greedy souls that you just have to buy more and more and more stuff all the time, who will never fry the beautiful earth I've given you to death, because you'll just be in relationship with me in a different way. If you will trust me and order your lives and welcome the sojourner and the immigrant among you and teach them about me and my ways, then my character will be known. And there will be a body of those who follow me, which is like nothing natural in all that has ever been. And there will be people of every race and every tongue and every language and every nation. And they'll all be together before me. And it'll be a signal and a sign to all people that I have created all humans out of one blood. And that I desire to reunite them in me. God is not to blame for the mess that we are making of the world. But he cares deeply all the time. And he is present. And he's calling his people today to get happy, good, right theology, not as an egg-headed thing, but as a thing in keeping with who he is, and let that set them free into living, into being his new world. And that happens ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ. And Jesus is the ultimate burning bush. Jesus is the glory of God, is the human being fully alive. And the life of the human being is the vision of God. Jesus says that he sees the Father and he hears from the Father and he does only what the Father tells him to do. He says that he has the Spirit of God without limit. He calls himself the human being. Son of Man means the human being. He's the new human being. He is the burning bush. And people see him and they are, attracted to him. We read it. We know this. We see it in the Gospels. And Jesus takes the I am statement, and in a way, it is the cross for him as well. In John's Gospel, there's 7 famous I am statements. Jesus recognizes that he has to use metaphor. And so he goes around saying things like, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. And we know that these things are metaphors, but they're also more than that. They're sacramental, right? If you got Jesus in you, you know you have light in you. I mean, it's metaphorical. You don't open your mouth and light come out, but you know, you can see, you can breathe, you have an open horizon. There's something in you that wasn't there before, that isn't closed and dark and heavy. When we are with Jesus, we are fed, and the bread of life is in us, whether we're at his table or whether we're listening to him or whatever it is. And he spoke these things that are metaphors, yet somehow also mystically more than metaphors, and he gave 7 of them, of course, because 7 is the number of wholeness in the ancient world. But then he gives one more. And that's the day when he's arguing with them and they've finally gotten fed up with him and they're like, who do you think you are? Do you really think you're better than Abraham, our father? Because you're just so threatening to our understanding of the story and of who we are and of our privileged place in Abraham. That's what they're saying. And Jesus looks at them and he says, before Abraham was, I am. And what do? They pick up stones to stone him. And at that point, they're done. And from that point on, they've decided we're going to kill him. Because he's just gone too far. Because he's identified himself with that God who is simply the essence of all being. And so Jesus' cross, in a way, is wrapped up with his I am statements. And Jesus, friends, is that burning bush for us. That's a lot of stuff. What's it all come down to for us? In very real ways, what it comes down to for us right here for Trinity is this. We are not called to take sides about X, Y, or Z. We are called to care about X, Y, and Z. We're called to speak into, learn about, be humble, be attentive, listen about X, Y, and Z. But we're called to start at the burning bush of Jesus and his cross. So whatever kind of inadequate stuff you got in church growing up, inasmuch as it helps you to talk about that, to move past it, let's talk about it. Talk about it as much as you need to. But inasmuch as in our frustration we want to do other than that, or just not be that, or whatever that is, I want to say no. We got to be a step past that. Make sense? I have friends who are simply living their lives in reaction over against, I'm not talking about anybody here, in reaction over against their fundamentalist upbringing. And I say to them, they don't like it, but it's true. I say, friend, I'm telling you, they're still running your life. Because you're still playing in their box. You're just trying to break out of it. You're just mad about it. But they are still the referent point for your life. You're still living with the competitive God. You just want to fight him. How do we move to a place where, yes, whatever we need to do to heal from that, we do it. We talk about it in those ways as much as we need to, but we're going beyond it. And we're going to that burning bush, and we're sitting at that burning bush, and we're listening to what God has for us to do. And we're getting reset of the vision of a people who would have no poor among them, and a people who would be from every race and every tribe and every nation, and a world and a beauty and an earth that would be beautiful and flourish, because it would be deeply wrapped up in the life of the God who loves it all and who made it all. And it would all work together in a way that just seems natural to us, because it is the ultimate natural thing as well as supernatural thing. I hope that makes sense. So 3 things this morning to wrap up. The first one is this. If you have a care about it at all, go home and read the Barron article and rejoice. Rejoice This is perhaps a little backwards of what you might think, a little counterintuitive. Rejoice that the current disaster of our faith in Western culture is largely due to bad theology. Rejoice in that because it's oddly encouraging, because it means that Paul was right in Galatians when he said God cannot be mocked. Follow that? You see a way of seeing it that way? It means that when we don't give God his due and let him be as big and true as he is, it has consequences. And that is actually good news, because it means God cannot be mocked. It also means that good theology sets us free. It also means that good theology brings life, that good theology makes our souls sing. It means that God is still in charge. He's still the reference point, no matter what people say. So rejoice in that. Second, like Mary, whatever it takes. You got to let your house be messy. You got to not eat as fast. Let somebody else not eat. Whatever it takes, get to that burning bush and sit there. Get to the feet of Jesus and sit there. I start every day right here. Now, I'm an Anglican, and that means I'm a son of the Reformation, and I know that Jesus completed his work on the cross, and I rejoice in that. I'm not saying, Jesus, you're back on the cross for me. What I'm saying is thank you. And this is taking me back to a place of saying thank you. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for that moment which changed all the world. Thank you for this place where the I am and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all come together. And this opens up the marriage of those two. I start every day right here. Do what it takes to get to the feet of Jesus. And if your life is just that pressed, if especially for moms of little ones, if you can only get 5 minutes, get those 5 minutes and don't feel bad about it. Just get them. Just tell him. Say, look, I'm exhausted. I can't think. I can't put together a coherent thought, but here I am. God will say, I'm so glad you're here. He'll say, don't worry about it. I can do the thinking for us. He'll just hug you. You just be there. You're not performing. You're just being there. Third thing, if you're sitting at that burning bush and you're going, okay, I'm at the burning bush, this is good, and you get in a habit of that and this is good, and then you go, okay, God, you had something for Moses. I mean, what do you want for me to do? Right? What do you want for me to do? In the Anglican way, we learned from and continue the practice of what's called spiritual direction. And it's a Thomist thing. Speaking of Aquinas this morning, it's a thing that recognizes that God has given you specific gifts and a specific personality and wired you a certain way and caused you to see the world a certain way and think a certain way and all the rest. And he has been working in your life before you even knew it. And it's a lovely and trusted person who will simply listen to you tell that story, and they'll help you find the threads of God in it and let you carry on then with those. It's called spiritual direction. We have 5 trained spiritual directors at Trinity. Wendy, Mother Wendy, Father Ross, Bob, Craig, Jennifer Drummond, and Sue Curry. And I think Drummonds and Currys are away this week. So chat with Wendy, chat with Ross. They know the others and they can help you. Chat with Bob this morning. Spiritual direction is a good thing. And it's one of the ancient and time-honored ways of learning how to walk from the burning bush into the path God has for me, for you. Friends, let's sit together at the feet of the Lord in silence for a few moments. I invite you in your imagination, whatever works best for you, you literally put yourself at the burning bush, put yourself at the feet of the cross, put yourself at the feet of Jesus in Mary and Martha's home, just whichever one works for you. all the cares that you brought with you about the big world or about your particular world. Can you hear God say, I am? In spite of all that, in the midst of all that, I am.